How's it going, everyone? Welcome back. In today's video, I kind of wanted to basically do a different type of video and kind of do an overview of loads of different techniques. So I recently started a blog which kind of goes a bit more into detail on certain topics I don't necessarily discuss in tutorials, and includes links and all that kind of thing, and includes different references to different tutorials, and it kind of basically like a more in-depth learning resource that kind of compiles similar things together. So like I've started a few and there's all sorts of kind of topics, but I'll just go back. I don't know why that's jumped ahead. Basically all kinds of topics, basically like plugins, but the one I did recently was this one here. So when it comes to like minimal house stabs and chords and stuff and those kind of sounds, there's loads of different ways you can do it. It's kind of like music in general. There's not really like one set way to do something. There's loads of different ways. And when it comes to these sounds, there's loads of different techniques. So I basically compiled this together, and it basically summarizes the genre and covers the tutorial. This was the tutorial I did, which like goes into depth on everything you need to know in the process. So we'll touch on some of the things I did there, but in much shorter form because it was quite a comprehensive tutorial. But I had loads of good like reviews about it, so I'd recommend checking it out if you have the chance. But we basically have various techniques that you can use to create these sounds, and that's kind of going to be what this tutorial is about. I'm basically going to try and kind of whiz through them all and basically give you a bunch of options when it comes to creating these sounds. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Okay, so to begin with, I've basically got this loop here which has vocals, drums, bass with a bit of texture, some leads, and then it's basically in the kind of ideal position to basically start writing some chords. And then I've got all the techniques down here, so I'll just play the loop. And I feel like it's at like the ideal stage to add chords now. It's not overly complicated, but at this point I would probably start to add a bit more. So it's quite a basic loop. And basically what I normally do is I normally have the leads here, and then I normally have the chords. So I've got this pattern here, which I was just using as like an example. So it kind of shows like that chords do fit this quite well. And basically, let's just kind of like get onto the techniques now. So the first one is your like autofilter. So basically automating the autofilter and modulating it. So the power of the autofilter, like when I figured it out that the autofilter was the kind of like difference maker with these sounds, it kind of changed a lot for me in terms of like my thinking and stuff, because I was always chasing a specific sound and I didn't even realize like it was as easy as using the autofilter. So I'll play this layer here that I've got. It's quite a busy chord pattern. And then when I introduce the autofilter, what I would normally do is basically the chain I've got is like the EQ and modulation, and then that doesn't really matter, like it changes from sound to sound. But I basically introduce this autofilter, and then normally I'd start with this, and I'd basically try and find I'd crank the resonance up and try and find a frequency that's quite nice for a specific sound. So this sound has a lot of potential around here. So I've kind of got that, and basically I kind of want to find somewhere where it sits quite nicely, but it has room to move up or down, depending on what filter you use. You do obviously have the option to use other ones, and then basically where the difference is made is when you're adding movement to that filter. So you could go in and add like an LFO to control it that way, or you could simply just crank the LFO up. So in this case, I've got it quite high, and you'll like hear the difference it makes to the sound. Off. So you can obviously experiment with the amount and the rate as well. I've got it at not overly fast. I don't want the filter movement effect to be overly fast, but you can crank it up. I find 1 to 2 tends to work quite well. Not for this sound, but in general. And then obviously experiment with like the frequency. So it's essentially doing this, and the speed is determined by how fast, and the amount it's moving is, you know how like LFOs work. But when I discovered that this was essentially what I was looking for with regards to like synth stabs, and those like dubby textures you often hear, like I said, it was kind of like a bit of a game changer in regards. And then you can obviously combine it with like space-based effects for like that proper sound, you know. Obviously the main patch that you choose helps massively, but if you want to kind of turn any sound, like chord sound, into that, then it works really well. Number 2 is one I've actually done a tutorial on, which I will link just now, which is basically the kind of percussive vocoder trick, where you're essentially taking a rhythmic loop of some kind and you're combining it with a carrier. So you're basically taking the rhythm of the loop and the sound of the carrier and kind of merging them into one. So just to kind of run through, if you want like a more in-depth tutorial, that tutorial will probably be a better one for you, but this one's also a really quick handy trick you can use. So you essentially find a drum loop. So I've got this, and then I have a carrier, which is this synth layer. You can go crazy on this kind of part. Like you could have a basic sound like an analog here, but what I've done is I've merged them with multiple patches. I've got this Juno and I've got this Omnisphere one, like a kind of human choir. In full, without effects, and just like phasers and reverbs. Don't overthink them. And so this is your source, and you can obviously play around. You could maybe like basically do what we did above with the filter and have some movement there. Basically experiment to your heart's desire on the actual carrier, because it does make a difference. And then essentially what you're wanting to do is load the vocoder with the external carrier and then the audio from that source, the carrier, post effects, and then you can like play around with these settings. So it'll sound like this. And you'll hear you get that kind of like synthy texture, which is almost stabby in a way. If I just play it with context. So it's slightly different in regards to like the character. Like these kind of, it's almost like a texture, like a chord stab kind of texture. But it works really well, and I think I actually I did use it above originally in this kind of section here. You can like maybe like try and blend it with your drums. So it becomes more of a like rhythmic layer as opposed to a melodic one. Basically like trying to strike a fine line between the two, maybe. All comes down to what you want to do really. But that technique is like a really quick and easy one you can use, and you can obviously experiment with different carriers, experiment with different like rhythmic loops, because the transients make a difference. Number 3 is just a quick recap from the last one we did, which is like your pad stabs. So when you're dropping samples that have multiple voicings in them into a simpler, and then you're playing around with like transposition. So I have this chord here, E minor, but when I transpose that E minor chord, so you've got like the transposition of the effect of moving a chord up, basically, when you do that. So basically take any chord sample and drop it in, and it always sounds pretty nice. Just make sure it's in key, and then you have more options. When the beauty of like the sampler simpler with these kind of sounds is there's like loads of room for manipulation. So I've got a few things here. Basically, if I map like these kind of parameters, the start point, because this particular sample is a pad, it basically evolves over time. So I can move it to different start points, and it will sound somewhat different no matter where I start it. And then you can obviously like use like granular synthesis and like move it, loop sections and that kind of thing, which you could do in audio form, but it gives you different options really. Like when you're using it in MIDI and you're like chopping it up like this and looping certain segments, it gives you different ways of working essentially. I wouldn't say one's better than the other, but the pad stab trick is like a really nice trick to use if you just want to get crazy with samples you already have. Technique number 4 is kind of like doing it from scratch. So I touch on this in a lot more detail in part, the pattern part of that chord tutorial, Chords like the Pros tutorial. But just to kind of recap, basically this technique's kind of to do with like resampling. So it's kind of related to that pad stab one. And basically the way it works is doing it from scratch, but so I've got this pattern here with various effects. So I've basically just programmed the chord, programmed the notes, found some effects, and then you might stop at that point and move on to another chord, but the technique kind of comes when you bounce it out into audio. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure it's recording from the right channel first. I'll go resampling, and then I'll just solo that, so it should just record from that, and I'll record it, which has worked. And then if I just put that on, sound we get is, which works, quite quick and dubby, which is what we like. So here you kind of have two ways you can go. You can either keep it in audio form and kind of manipulate it in audio form. So you could like duplicate it, you could reverse it, you could repitch them, you could shorten them. Basically every different thing you can do in audio. So you can do that kind of thing. If you had like a longer sample that you recorded, you'd probably have more options, but I've kept it quite short. Doesn't matter. You can basically take it further than chords and turn it into like textures and that kind of thing. The options are unlimited really, but I think the kind of point here is that moving it into audio form gives you different options, and I think a lot of people sometimes keep it within MIDI, which maybe to some extent is a bit more restrictive. But the other direction you can go if you don't want to just keep it in audio is putting it back into the sampler simpler like this. So it basically takes you to the pad stab technique and then rinse and repeat technique number 3 and just see what it sounds like. So we go from this chord to something in the simpler where we don't necessarily have the customization of going into the patch anymore, but that kind of frees us up to focus on other ways we can manipulate samples. So that's kind of like technique 4, and yeah, that's a pretty cool technique to try, and it basically just involves resampling the chords, and you could theoretically, because it's resampling into audio and then playing around with the audio, you could theoretically resample any of these. It's just kind of about like using audio as an option, and then maybe if you want to, you could like re-put that audio into the sampler and get creative and that kind of thing. So just another way of doing things really. Or number 5 is like multi-effects and tantra. Tantra's being one of the effects, but it doesn't really matter. Like you can use any multi-effects, but the kind of aim of this technique is using effects that can make your sounds be chord based and that kind of thing. So I've got this sound here when I put it on. So I've used a chord in this example, but it's not necessarily like a stabby type of chord. It's basically just a pad. And when I play it short, it doesn't really work. I'd have to move it to kind of get it to work, but other ways you can kind of create these kind of chord stab effects are these like multi-effects plugins. So the one that comes to mind and one I've seen spoken about before is Tantra. So Tantra is basically multi-effects, all these different effects in one. So you can basically add dub to a sound to kind of give it that character. So it's kind of less about designing the sound and more about when you already have the sound, how you can shape it into that kind of vibe. So Tantra's probably the best one I'd recommend, because you get like these sequencer presets. And you could maybe even like try combining it with the autofilter kind of automation if you want. Crank it up. There we go. So stuff like that, like these kind of multi-effects plugins basically allow you to send the majority of sources through them and get some kind of crazy results, and it just so happens that Tantra just kind of suits the genre of minimal house really well for that kind of thing. It's really like dubby filtered sound. So Tantra's one option, and there's so many different options that I probably won't talk about them all. I don't have time. But the other one that I find quite cool is like the Sound Toys Filter Freak ones. So I'll just close this. Filter Freak number 2 has like 2 bands, so I tend to use that more than one, but I don't think there's a better one for this specific purpose. So I've got this, you can get these presets here. There's different ones, so these ones kind of like sweep. I'll turn the autofilter off as well. So this kind of does the job of the autofilter, but as you see, like the band, it's got multiple bands. It's basically the equivalent of multiple autofilters moving with an LFO, doing different things. That's basically how I think of it. So that's kind of like the sweeping, but the rhythmic ones are a bit more interesting. So I like this preset here. So we can basically take this sound, pad sound, and turn it into something a bit more chord based or texture based. It kind of depends what kind of scope you're going for. Scope, I don't even think that's the right word. What you're going for depends. So yeah, that's basically technique number 5, is like multi-effects plugins, Tantra being one of them, but there's not really like a limit to which one you use, and it's all about just getting creative like most of these, but it's definitely a good technique to try. And then finally, number 6, this is kind of like the synth loop manipulation tutorial I did, and it basically involves taking a loop, so not your pad single one-shot sample, if you will. It's more like getting a loop which varies over time and then chopping it up. So if I play this, I'll take this off. Let's see if this works. Probably not gonna work, is it? Good work. Alright, that's why. So I've got this loop here. So there's a lot of variation within that loop, and you'll probably hear what's gonna happen. You're basically taking segments from that loop where there's loads of different chords within and that kind of thing, loads of things you could make into chords. I'll just turn this up. So it's kind of similar to the pad stab idea where you could move the start point of the pad stab to different points. But the difference here is that the synth loop should be more interesting because it's a loop, so there's more going on and different pitches, different sounds, different rhythms, that kind of thing. So essentially what I do is I slice these loops, and then you can play around with how you slice it. But beat, is it beat? You can like, yeah, beat, and then you can slice it obviously into like 16ths, which is perhaps too short sometimes, but it works. I'm trying to find like the, so if I just play this. I'll just do this. So you basically have the option of like, you can try and find those bits of ear candy within these loops and play it in manually. But the trick I like to use is basically just dropping a MIDI kind of sequencer in there. So there's two options I would recommend for this, but any sequencer should work. So the APC mono sequencer. So basically what I've done is I've drawn in this is like the gate, so when you want the note to play, and then the pitch, so which notes I want it to play. So if you look at this, there's not much variation, but you'll see it moving around. So it'll do that, and then you obviously have different options of the sequencer, which I'm not really going to get into. But another trick you can use is you can use like the auto splitting tool that we have on our website, and basically just move up and down an octave to basically cover different sounds. And the other one you can use is like probabilistic, where it's the same kind of thing. It's like different gate settings and then different notes. But the way it works is slightly different, and you can like get a bit crazy with regards to like how it moves. So if I play so you basically hear it's like kind of like a background texture. So basically it can be quite useful to kind of sit in the background, but if you're gonna that's if you make it like relatively complicated like this, but you could literally just like strip it down to like 1 or 2 notes maybe. And then you could add some effects. Maybe I've added a compressor because it can be quite quiet. And then you could go into technique 4, resample into audio, and then chop up into audio. Like if I just do this, if it's gonna work, let's see. And then you've got your own original rhythm with the same sound. It's kind of like why that technique's so good. And then you obviously have the upsides of going in and manipulating if you want. You could then chop it and that kind of thing. So it all Depends on what you want really. Like you could make it quite a complex pattern, or you could do all that, but you're basically left with a nice pattern that's putting your own twist on the original loop. And that's essentially like the 6 techniques in a nutshell really. Like if I play all of them, you'll hear how it's quite easy to find a place for each one of these kind of techniques within your process, and like all of them work, and like they don't really sound terrible either. Like you'll hear that's basically how I'd basically have my chords when I got to that part of the process. Basically have them like bouncing off one another, and that kind of standard kind of minimal house sound you often hear in some tracks where they utilize loads of chords. So yeah, that is essentially going to be it for this one. I hope you found it useful, and I hope it can like serve as a nice reference for when you need a bit of inspiration and you need kind of a few techniques to get you started, or you're maybe designing those sounds and you're at a bit of a loss on how you go about doing that. I hope you can maybe like refer back to this tool and the various techniques I've spoke through. And feel free to check out the blog as well, because that will have the same techniques. So whatever way of learning you prefer, I hope it can be useful to you anyway. And yeah, if you liked the video, be sure to like, hit subscribe, because there's gonna be more coming, including that bass one. We'll get to that one at some point. But yeah, for now, I'll leave that one there. See you in the next one.